Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review. Today we have a design that falls into one of the defined design style categories. So the title isn't an interpretive one, it is straight free expression, which is a defined design style. And for this competition, I'm going to read you the definition because I don't remember it basically. So free expression is a creative design of modern concept, not meeting the guidelines of any other listed modern style. So modern styles, just to recap, are those that were prevalent in the 60s and 70s, where there was a move away from the traditional massed flowers to something that was a little bit more in keeping with the design, the interior design trends of the time. So minimal lines, and use of dried material as well as fresh material, and a little bit more expressive in their artistic form. The design may, however, borrow characteristics from other styles, including some traditional type placements. So they would be the radial placements. The absence of specific guidelines allows great scope for creativity. It may be radial in construction or have more than one point of emergence from the container or design. One or more containers may be used. So that's the definition, and here is the design that I submitted for judging on the day. It didn't get, in this particular competition, it's only first and second given, and it didn't get a placing, and I don't recall any feedback that I got specifically about this design. There was general talk about the interpretation of that definition and how most of the designs met the criteria. Interestingly, I have used this container before, and the last time I used it, I think there's actually a video on it. I was marked down because it was considered two containers, and I remember that in the feedback, the general feedback, this was talked about as being one container because they could see the join in the middle, even though there's two openings. So you win some, you lose some, I guess. What I've got here is a slice of Banksia as the base, then the container, which is an Ikebana container that was gifted to me by a wonderful floral artist in his own right, and he has passed since the time that he gave it to me, and so I like to use it just to think of him and remember the wonderful designs that he created in his time. But he was very much more into Ikebana than traditional floral art. So into each side of the container, on one side I've based it with Banksia leaves, both sides, to give it some continuity. I've got a Banksia flower on one side, the fresh one, and I've got three buds from the agapanthus on the right hand side, and they're stepped up, and using one that's got a little bit of a curve in the stem just to give it some movement. And then I have the dried agapanthus stalk and seed head on the left hand side, and joining the two is a palm spade that's dried, and I've just sort of woven them through the placements on either side to connect them in some way and be a reflection of the base material. Now looking at it now, I can see some things that I would do differently. So we'll go straight into the analysis and see what our AI Design Eye has got to say about the design, and then we'll look at some of the suggestions for improvement. Looking at line, first of all, the design establishes a strong interplay of lines. The rigid vertical lines of the dried stalk and fresh green stems anchor the piece, while the dramatic sweeping curve of the dried palm spade creates a powerful directional line that bridges the two containers. That's true. It's interesting that it sees the agapanthus, the green agapanthus, as vertical lines. They are vertical lines, but I think they're more curved, in my eye, they're more curved than the dried stalk. And one of the things that's standing out for me is how straight that dried stalk is and how it's not really reflected as part of the rest of the design. It doesn't feel like it's part of the design. And I think some of it is that it needs to come down a bit lower. It's a bit too high. It shouldn't be the highest point of the design. I don't think it should be sort of a third of the way between the top of the Banksia and the top of the green agapanthus buds that are on the right hand side. Texture. There is exceptional textural variety. The smooth glazed surface of the ceramic container And the sleek green stems provide a stark contrast to the rough papery surface of the dried spathe and the spiky dried seed head, the dense fuzzy texture of the Banksia. So, as was the case with a lot of my designs in this period of time, texture was where I focused, and I particularly wanted to focus on texture in this one because I didn't want colour to be the contrast within the design. I really like having texture as the contrast in the design because I think that is part of the beauty of working with natural materials, is that there is so much contrast in textures that we can use. So I'm happy with the contrast in the texture in this design, and I think that there's enough of each of them. There's smooth and rough, shiny and matte, that it balances itself out even with the quite wide variety of contrasts that are within those placements. Colour. The designer has used a very effective split palette. Warm earthy browns and tans of the wood slice, container and dried botanicals serve as a grounding neutral canvas. This allows the vibrant green of the buds and the foliage along with the yellow green of the Banksia to pop intensely, and I think that's very true. I think it's hard with that background of the brick wall and the blackboard, but I think that there is a great contrast in the colours without it being jarring. So you are drawn to the green, but then you see the rest of the design, and it's just sort of, as it says, it's a grounding, and it's a soft background for the green and the yellow that pops out. Form. The geometric cylindrical forms of the dual container contrast beautifully with the organic, irregular forms of the botanical materials, particularly the chaotic burst of the dried seed head and the undulating ribbon-like form of the dried leaf. The form in this design, so the shapes that are created, I think are sympathetic. The one that stands out for me as being out of place is that stem, that stalk of the dried agapanthus head. I think that the form of that is too straight for the rest of the design. And had it been down a little bit lower and not quite so obvious, I think it would have worked better in the design as a whole. Space. By utilising two distinct points of emergence, the designer has successfully activated the negative space between the two cylinders. The dried leaf acts as a canopy, framing the void and making the empty space an active part of the composition. So this is very important in these modern designs. It was the introduction of the real use of negative space as part of your design. And so you can see that the space between underneath the dried palm spathe and the top of the containers, that space there is part of the design, as is the part underneath the spathe outside of the design. You are drawn there and then drawn back because of the curve, because of the shape of the spathe. I would still like to see that the agapanthus seed head come down a little bit closer to the palm spathe, so that the top of the design was that top green agapanthus bud that isn't yet opened. I think it would give a better stepping through the space as well. It's not going to detract from the use of the negative space, because the space between the agapanthus stalk and the agapanthus fresh bud is not really as useful in terms of the negative space as the negative space underneath the palm spathe. So we could lose a bit of that without too much detriment in the design. Contrast. The design leans heavily on the contrast between life and decay, fresh and dried, as well as contrasting textures and forms. So we've covered both the textures and the forms already. The contrast is there. I think there's contrast in the colours as well, not in the usual sense of contrasting colours, but there is enough of a contrast that you see the difference between those two colour groupings that are there. Balance. The piece achieves a complex asymmetrical balance. The extreme height of the dried stalk on the left is counterbalanced by the visual weight and rightward sweep of the dried spathe, along with the stepping height of the fresh green buds on the right. Now, I don't think the balance would be lost by bringing that agapanthus seed head down a little bit. In fact, I think it would be enhanced, and I think that would reduce the complexity of the asymmetrical balance somewhat, because it would bring the balance back into line a little bit more. It would still be asymmetrical because of the weighting of the seed head and the spade, but I think it would be a little bit more attractive to the eye than it is at the moment, my eye anyway. Rhythm. A strong sense of visual rhythm is created by the 3 green buds stepping upward in height, leading the viewer's eye through the arrangement and echoing the upward thrust of the other materials. I would like to see that part of the design a little bit more dominant, and I think I should have brought the lowest of the buds further out away from the palm space, or just so that you could see it against the palm spade, and just the spacing between them is probably, the gap between the middle and the top one is probably too much. I need to bring that middle one up a little bit higher. Leave the bottom one where it is, but bring the next one up a little bit higher, and then bring that seed head down a little bit so that you're not drawn to that away from the rest of the design, which has got a nice flow and rhythm to it. Proportion and scale. The container size is well scaled to the rustic wood slice base. The towering height of the dried elements pushes the boundaries of proportion, but ultimately succeeds in giving the piece a dramatic contemporary flair. I think that's been very generous in its analysis. I think that the proportion is not right in terms of that dried agapanthus seed head, and it needs to be brought down a little bit into the design a little bit more so that the proportions are better and you get a better overall shape to the design. So let's now have a look at some of the suggestions that we have for improving this design. The first one is concealing the mechanics. In the right-hand cylinder, there appears to be a visible white placement peering over the lip of the container. In competition, absolute cleanliness is paramount. Adding a touch more basing foliage or sinking the mechanics a fraction lower would ensure a flawless finish. Now, what it's seeing is the underside of those banksia leaves, which is a silvery grey colour, so coming up white in this particular image. And whilst it's not in terms of a live judging, it's not detrimental so much. Had I been looking at this live, I still would have been concerned that I could see that, because that's a deliberate choice that we sometimes make of showing the underside of the leaf because it's a different colour to the top side. So magnolia leaves are a great case in point because they're brown on one side, velvety brown on one side and glossy green on the other. The banksia leaves are similar, dark green on one side and that silvery grey on the underside. What I needed to do was ensure that the undersides weren't showing, or if I wanted them to show, that colour was reflected somewhere else, which it isn't, so they shouldn't be showing. So I needed to be a bit more careful about the actual placements of that material. So whilst the analysis is looking at concealing the mechanics, thinking that that's part of the mechanics of the placement, it's about the placement. It's the placement that needs addressing, and that would improve the design by not having that white or that silvery grey showing in the design when it's not reflected anywhere else in the design. Number 2 is focal unification. Because there are 2 distinct emergence points, the eye naturally jumps between the bright banksia on the left and the cluster of green foliage on the right, while the dried spathe connects them physically, integrating a tiny touch of the fresh green foliage at the base of the left cylinder, or a small piece of the dried material at the base of the right, would unify the 2 separate visual anchors into one cohesive base. I think it needs work in terms of focal unification, and I think that bringing that, as I've said all along, bringing that agapanthus seed head down a little bit would help. because it would bring down that dried element closer to the dried element. And I think that perhaps if I had had something that the container's got two holes in the middle of the joining ceramic piece. If I'd had a piece of bark or some more of the palm spade that twisted through those and cut the facing of the container a little bit more, then that would have been reflected, because it would have been a repetition of the form of the palm spade, of the dried material, keeping the colours in the colour palette, not introducing anything else, but bringing that dried element down a little bit further into the base of the design so that it unified it a little bit more, as it says, that focal unification. So number 3 is walking the design, and this is something that I'm continuously talking about now in terms of looking at your design the way a judge would look at it. So the sweeping dried leaf is spectacular from this front-facing angle, but it's highly structural. It's crucial to walk the design to evaluate how that broad flat plane reads from other angles to ensure it has an interesting profile and that the mechanics holding it in place are completely invisible. And that's very true. Even though it says that it's going to be judged from the front, when a judge approaches it, they're not going to approach it straight on. If it's along a long bench, they're going to walk along the bench. And so they're going to see a side view before they see the front view. Yes, the final judging will be done front view, but their first impression might well be from the side. So you do need to ensure that everything is as perfect as you can make it, that the mechanics are invisible unless you want them to be focused and visible as part of the design, that everything's clean. And this is the issue with those Banksia leaves, is that I should have turned them over so that only the green was showing. So it's about walking that design with a clear head, going away from it or closing your eyes and opening your eyes again and just having a look from either side just to make sure that nothing is glaringly obvious. I have seen designs where cable ties have been used to hold things in place, and one single tail on a cable tie has been left uncut, untrimmed, and when you look at the side, you say, oh, there's that one there, but you haven't seen it from the front view. And a judge is going to see that, because if you've got 2 or 3 designs that are really close in terms of their interpretation or their meeting the definition, then they're going to look for things that make the difference. And the finish on a design is what makes the difference in that case, and quite often in most of the design work that we see on the bench. So think about that, walking the design, and have a look at some of the other videos where I talk about walking the design and how you can assess and make that part of your process when you're putting a design together. So there we have our interpretation and our analysis of free expression. This one's from 2022, so a few years ago now. But some good suggestions, some good feedback from our AI about the design. As always, I will remind you that you can have your own designs assessed in this way. You can get a report that is as comprehensive as this about your designs, whether it's a finished design, whether you're halfway through, whether you're just still thinking about a design and playing around. It's completely private. You don't have to be in a competition. You can develop your design skills at your own pace, and that's what it's there for. So I'll leave you this week and join you again next week for another design. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.